The Han estate sat above the city the way old power always does, not announcing itself, simply existing at a height that made everything below it look arranged for its benefit. Inside the main hall, the air smelled of cedar and expensive cologne and something underneath both that had no clean name. Men in dark suits moved between low lacquered tables. Ink paintings held the walls like old arguments no one had bothered to finish. Ceramic cups were filled and emptied with the practiced ease of people who had never once in their lives been told to wait. Tari Maro stood at the edge of the hall. She was not hiding. Hiding is for people who are afraid. She was simply still, the way a person is still when they have been waiting for something for 2 years and have finally arrived at the room where it lives. She held a wine glass she had not touched. Around her, the serving team moved in the patterns she had designed herself 2 weeks earlier when she pitched the catering contract to the Han household with a folder of references she had spent 6 months building. Every reference was real. Every person in that folder had spoken well of her because she had worked to earn it. The cover was not a lie stretched over nothing. It was a lie laid over something genuine, which is always harder to see through. She was watching Joonki Han. He stood at the center of the room the way a fixed point stands in the middle of a movement, not drawing attention, simply being the thing everything else orbited, tall, immaculate in black. The jade bracelet at his left wrist, catching the lantern light once as he raised his cup. Tari already had what she came for. She had found it 90 minutes earlier in the study on the 2nd floor while her team set up the serving stations, and she slipped away for the 11 minutes she had calculated she would need. The Hojok registry had been exactly where the building plans suggested, in the lower left drawer of an old camphor wood desk, beneath a letter from a man 6 years dead. She had photographed every page. She had returned to the hall with her expression unchanged and her heartbeat, she was quite certain, elevated by no more than it should have been. And now she was thinking about a name she had seen in those photographs, a name that had been carefully, deliberately removed from a record that was supposed to be permanent. A name she knew. A name she had grown up hearing at a dinner table that no longer existed. This was the part of the plan where she was supposed to leave. She had not left. She was still watching him when he noticed her. It lasted 3 seconds, the kind of look that is not social or polite but purely observational, the way one careful person takes the measure of another. His eyes moved on. His expression did not change, but he had seen her. She knew because 30 seconds later, Miri Choi appeared at her elbow. Mr. Han would like the catering supervisor to be seated. Miri's voice was even and careful. The servants' table is in the east corridor. The hall did not go quiet. The conversations continued. The cups were filled. But Tari understood, in the way that a woman who has survived public scrutiny always understands, that the room had registered this moment, not loudly, just accurately. She turned to face Miri fully. She let the pause breathe. "Of course," she said. She took her wine glass. She walked toward the east corridor at her own pace. Not fast, not slow, not performing anything for anyone watching. Behind her, Joonki Han returned to his conversation. He did not see the slight curve at the corner of her lips. She had not always known it would come to this. There was a time, not so long ago, when she knew nothing about the Han family or the particular silences that money builds around the damage it leaves behind. She had known only what she was growing up, a father who laughed too easily, who argued with market traders like they were people worth convincing, who wore traditional fabric on Sundays like it was armor, and who believed, and with the kind of belief that is either beautiful or dangerous depending on what the world does with it, that a man's word was the most durable thing he owned. His name was Thomas Maro. He had built something real from nothing, the way people do when failure has no affordable version. A trading company, small at first, then substantial enough that people flew in to meet him. People with interpreters and briefcases and proposals printed on paper so heavy it had its own sound when you set it down. One of those proposals had come through an intermediary connected to a Han family investment vehicle. A distribution partnership worth more than anything Thomas had ever been offered. He signed it. 6 months later, the investment vehicle dissolved. The funds transferred out of the partnership account 2 days before the dissolution papers were filed. The timing was not accidental. The paper trail had been constructed by someone who understood exactly how much it needed to obscure and precisely what it could afford to leave visible. Tomas Maro lost everything, not some things. Everything. He died 14 months later. The doctors used words like cardiac event and chronic stress. Tari used a different word, privately, in the dark. She had used it every day since. She had spent the first year grieving, because grief does not wait for permission and does not respond to being told it is inconvenient. She spent the second year doing the thing that grief sometimes becomes when it finds a direction. She traced the intermediary, then the investment vehicle, then the signatures on the dissolution papers, then the name that appeared 2 layers back from the transaction, carefully insulated in a record that had been amended once and should not have been. Daeho Min, senior partner, elder of the Han inner circle, a man who sat at Joonki Han's right hand at every gathering that mattered. She did not know yet whether Joonki Han had known, whether he had ordered the transaction, inherited its consequences, or simply never asked the questions that would have required him to act. That distinction mattered to her. She was not certain it changed what she was going to do, but it mattered. She sat now at the servants' table in the East Corridor, looking at the plain wooden surface and the tea that had been poured for her without being asked. Around her, household staff moved and spoke in low voices. They were not unkind to her. A young woman refilled the cup without looking at her face, which Tari understood was its own form of courtesy. She turned the kente fabric at her wrist once between her fingers. Her mother had tied it there the morning Tari left for the city. She said nothing while she tied it. She held Tari's wrist afterward, both hands around it, eyes closed. Then she released her. That was all. No warning, no instruction, just the weight of 2 hands around a wrist, and then the road. Tari had the photographs on her phone. She had Zuri waiting at the east gate with a car and a hotel room booked under a different name. She had everything she needed to walk out of this house and never come back. And yet here she sat, at the servants' table, drinking tea she had not asked for, thinking about a man in a black suit with a jade bracelet on his wrist and eyes that had held her for exactly 3 seconds and seen something she had not prepared for. She did not know what he had seen. She was not sure why that bothered her. From the east corridor, Tari could see a portion of the main hall through a wide archway. Not the whole room. Enough. She watched the way a person watches when they have been preparing for a single evening for 22 months. Not with urgency, with the particular quality of attention that looks like patience from the outside and is something else entirely from the inside. At the head of the central table, Joonki Han presided without presiding. He said nothing he did not need to say. He poured for no one himself but watched, without appearing to watch, whether others were pouring correctly, whether the junior men deferred to the senior ones, whether the senior ones accepted without performance, whether the ritual of the room was maintaining its order. Tari had read about this. She had studied it the way she had studied everything else. The Confucian grammar of the Korean underworld, in which hierarchy was not stated but continuously enacted, in which every cup poured and every seat taken was a sentence in a language everyone in the room was permanently obligated to speak. She noticed the seating. Who sat where? Who rose when Joonki entered a new section of the room, and who merely turned? She filed it. Now, before we go any further into this room and what it contained, I want to pause for just a moment and ask you something, because stories like this one feel different depending on where you're sitting when you hear them. If you're watching this from a city where rooms like this one exist, where power moves this quietly and costs this much, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. This community is everywhere, and we love knowing where our stories are landing. At the right of the table, 1 seat below Joonki's, Daeho Min held court with his hands folded and his face arranged in the particular warmth of a man who has never once in his adult life needed to be warm. He was charming, the kind of charming that has been rehearsed until it has no seams showing. He leaned toward a younger man beside him and said something low, and the younger man laughed, and Daeho Min's eyes swept the room with satisfaction while the laugh was still happening. Tari watched him. She turned the kente fabric once at her wrist. In a proverb her grandmother had favored, the translation went roughly, "The crocodile does not move from the river. You come to the river, and there he is." She had always found this proverb less ominous than clarifying. She had come to the river, she was looking at the crocodile. Good. Now she knew exactly what she was dealing with. What she had not planned for was the footsteps in the corridor, not the household staff. Different, measured, one pair of footsteps, unhurried, with the particular rhythm of someone who does not modify their pace for a room. She did not look up immediately. She had trained herself not to react to sound the way a startled person does. She raised her eyes slowly. Joonki Han stood at the corridor entrance. He walked toward her, not toward the corridor exit, toward her table. She understood this was not accidental. Joonki Han did not do accidental things. She stayed seated. Standing would have been a performance. Staying seated was simply accurate. He did not sit. He stood at the end of the table, looking at her with the same quality of attention he had given her from across the hall. 3 seconds, 4. Then he said, "You're not angry." It was not a question. "Should I be?" she said. "Most people would be." "I'm not most people." He looked at her for another 2 seconds. Something shifted in the line of his jaw, not quite enough to name. "The catering supervisor," he said. "You designed the service layout yourself." "I did." "The formation in the East Wing is wrong. The servers are moving against the natural foot traffic. You know this." She did know this. She had designed it that way deliberately, specifically to create a reason for her own movement through the East Wing of the property 90 minutes before the guests arrived. She said, "I'll correct it." "There's nothing to correct. The service is finished for the evening." He paused. "Where are you from?" She told him the name of the city, the broad version, the one that required no follow-up. He received it. "You came far to serve a dinner." "I came far to build a business," she said. "The dinner is part of the business." He looked at her for so long that a lesser person would have filled the silence. She didn't. She had learned something important about silence from her father. The person who breaks it first has admitted that the quiet is costing them. She did not break it. He said, "You were watching Daeho Min." Her heartbeat registered the information. Her face did not. "I was watching the room," she said. "You were watching him specifically." She picked up the ceramic teacup and drank from it. It had gone cold. "He seems like the kind of man worth watching," she said. Something moved behind Joonki's eyes. Not anger, recognition. As though something she'd said had found a frequency he didn't expect from this direction. He straightened. "What is your name?" he asked. Not the business name, her name. "Tari." He nodded once, slowly, as though filing it somewhere permanent. He walked back toward the hall. He did not look back. She held the cold teacup in both hands and listened to his footsteps fade and thought about the 3 things that conversation had told her. 1. He was watching Daeho Min too. 2. He had come to the East Corridor not to humiliate her further but to understand what he had seen. 3. Joonki Han was not what she had expected, and she needed to be careful because nothing makes a plan brittle faster than a variable you underestimated. She turned the kente fabric at her wrist. Once, twice, stopped. Her father had trusted men who were charming. She was not going to make the same mistake by trusting the opposite, by deciding that a man who was not charming, who was cold and careful and looked at her like she was something he needed to understand, was therefore safe. Nobody in this house was safe. She reminded herself of this with the precision of someone who knows that the moments you need reminders most are the ones when you feel like you don't. Now I want to ask you something before we go further, because Daeho Min is about to step into the foreground of this story, and what he represents is something very specific. What do you think of a man who builds decades of comfort and influence on a decision he made once and then reclassified as business, a decision that destroyed someone else's entire life and then never once looked back? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because how you answer that question says something about where you think this story should go. An hour later, the gathering had thinned. Enough that the architecture of the room was more visible. Enough that Daeho Min, moving from the central table toward the drink service at the far wall, passed within 12 feet of the east corridor archway. Tari rose. She was a catering supervisor checking on her team. That was all. She moved into the hall's edge with her clipboard, which she carried because a woman with a clipboard in a room like this becomes furniture, and furniture is invisible. He arrived at the drinks table 2 meters away. Daeho Min in person was smaller than the version of him she had constructed from documents and records, and a name that had taken her 8 months to trace. He had the easy body language of a man whose power had never been meaningfully tested in at least a decade. He poured himself a measure of grain wine slowly, held it up to the light for a moment the way people do when they want to appear thoughtful, and drank. He looked at her. She looked at her clipboard. "Catering?" he said. "Yes, sir." Professional, warm at the edges, giving him nothing. "Good service tonight," he said. Very smooth. He said it with the authority of a man who believes his assessments constitute gifts. "Thank you, sir." He looked at her a moment longer, the practiced warmth doing what it always does, moving across the surface of another person in search of a reflection of himself. She gave him the reflection. She had prepared this specific performance for 3 months. She smiled just enough to be pleasant. She looked away first, not out of deference, but because she had decided that was the correct tactical response, and because looking at him any longer would have cost her something she was not willing to spend in this room. He moved away. He had already forgotten her. That was the man. That was the entire shape of him. Warm surface, nothing underneath except more surface. The kind of man who ruins something with both hands and then pours himself a drink and holds it up to the light and calls himself thoughtful. Her father had worked for 15 years. 15 years of early mornings and contracts drafted and renegotiated and drafted again, of staff salaries paid on time because he believed it mattered, of a dining room table that always had food on it and always had room for someone extra. He had believed that a man's word was the most durable thing he owned. He had brought gifts to that first meeting. He had believed he was building a partnership. He had been building his own ruin, and the man who handed him the materials was now standing 12 feet away, evaluating grain wine quality. Are you feeling something right now? Good. You should be. Tell us in the comments exactly what you'd like to say to a man like Daeho Min, because the comment section is the only place in this story where you get to speak. She returned to the east corridor. She sat down. She had 94 photographs on her phone and a car at the east gate, and every reason in the world to leave right now, tonight, before anything got more complicated. She did not move toward the gate. Miri Choi came to the east corridor at 20 minutes past 11. She did not send a staff member ahead of her. She came herself, which told Tari something before a word was spoken. People with nothing complicated to say send someone else. Miri sat down across from her. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at Tari the way a person looks at someone they have been thinking about for a long time before the actual meeting. "I ran a background check on you the day you submitted the catering proposal," Miri said. "I know," Tari said. "I built the cover to pass it." "It did pass it." Miri paused. "And then I ran a second check, deeper, the kind that's not looking for professional credibility." She looked at Tari's wrist, at the kente fabric. "I found the name Tari Maro." The corridor held the moment. Tari said nothing. She let the name sit in the air between them and waited to understand what Miri intended to do with it. "I was present on the night that transaction was arranged," Miri said. 8 years ago. I was new to this household. I was in the room because nobody thought I was worth removing from it." She said this without self-pity, just as information. "I have been holding what I heard in that room for 8 years, waiting for a direction." Tari listened to every word with the practiced attention her father had taught her. He had always said, "The best information arrives without announcing itself. What matters is whether you are quiet enough to hear it." What was decided that night, Tari said carefully, and by whom? Daeho Min gave the direction, the investment vehicle, the dissolution timing, the paper trail construction. That was his design. Miri's hands stayed folded. Joonki Han was 26 years old. He was not at that meeting. He was not told about that meeting. She paused. I am not certain he knows now. The weight of this was significant. Tari sat with it for a long moment, turning it from different angles the way her mother turned stones at the market, checking their underside before paying for them. She was not certain it changed what she had come to do, but it changed the shape of the thing considerably. There is more, Miri said. She reached inside the front fold of her navy jacket. She produced a key, flat, old, the kind cut for a mechanical lock. She placed it on the table surface between them, and her hand retreated. The lower archive room, second corridor past the study, beneath the stairs. The transaction records from that period are stored there, not in the Hojok registry, which was amended. The original documents with original signatures and original wire transfer details. They were never moved because moving them precisely would have left a trace of the movement. Tari looked at the key. She looked at Miri. Why? She said. One word, everything she needed to ask in it. Miri was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because his father built this house and Daeho Min has been living in it rent-free for 20 years, and I have been watching what that costs Joonki Han. She paused. And because Thomas Maro deserved to have someone say his name out loud in a room that owed him something. Tari reached out and closed her hand around the key. There was a moment, brief and private, not for anyone to see, where she pressed it against her palm and held it there. Her mother's hands around her wrist the morning she left. Her father at the dinner table, laughing at a market story. Her own hands, 12 months after his death, pulling his ledgers out of a storage unit and sitting on the concrete floor with them until 2 in the morning. She stood up. She said simply, "Thank you." Miri nodded. A single movement. Then, be finished before midnight. The night staff rotation changes at 1:15. The lower archive room smelled of cedar oil and old paper, the particular scent of documents that were never meant to be opened again. She found what she needed in the third drawer of the second cabinet, not filed under the Han name, filed under a shell company designation that she recognized from the dissolution papers. The same dead vehicle, the same 3-letter identifier. She pulled the documents. She laid them on the archive desk under the single overhead light. She photographed every page, methodically, corner to corner, making sure the signatures were legible. The wire transfer authorizations, the dissolution instruction, signed and dated 2 days before the filing. Daeho Min's name across 3 separate documents, not insulated this time, not 2 layers back, but direct and in full. Clear enough to be read by anyone who needed to read it. She replaced the documents in the order she had found them. She sent a single text to Zuri. Ready. She turned off the light. She locked the archive room door. She walked down the second corridor toward the east wing exit, and for approximately 4 minutes the night felt like it was willing to let her go. The corridor was empty. The staff rotation had not yet changed. Zuri would be at the gate. She had everything she needed. She pushed open the east wing exterior door. The night air was cold and clear. She could see the line of parked vehicles along the east path. She could see the gate. She could see at the gate 2 men she recognized as Han household security, and between them, sitting on the low stone wall with his hands visible and his face carefully composed, was Zuri. She did not move through the door. She stayed in its shadow, hand against the frame, and assessed. Zuri had been sitting there for at least 6 minutes by the posture of it, settled, not panicked, because Zuri Maku had never panicked in the 3 years she had known him. He was waiting. He had seen her in the doorway shadow. He gave her nothing across the distance. No signal, no eye contact. Smart. Doing exactly what they had agreed. If anything went wrong at the gate, he would absorb the attention and give her time to make a different decision. She stepped back into the corridor. She stood in the dark for a moment and breathed. The photographs were on her phone. The phone was in the inside pocket of the burgundy dress. She was inside a house with no exit and a room full of men who would have considerable interest in understanding exactly what she had been doing in the lower archive room. Her mind moved through options the way it always did under pressure, quickly, without catastrophizing, looking for the shape of a path. There was only one path that was not also a wall. She walked back toward the archive room. She had relocked the door and turned the light back on and was standing in the middle of the room when she heard the footsteps. One pair. Unhurried. That specific rhythm. She had time to put the key in her pocket. She had time to decide she was not going to pretend to be there for any reason other than the real one. Pretending required energy she preferred to spend elsewhere. The door opened. Joonki Han stood in the doorway of his own archive room looking at her. "I left the gathering twice this evening," he said. "Both times I found myself in a corridor." He stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. That stopped being a coincidence the second time. He moved to the archive desk. He looked at the surface. He looked at the phone in her hand. He did not reach for it. "The Hojok registry," he said. "The lower archive. You came here for specific documents." "Yes." "Show me. Before we go into what happens next, I need to know if you've already figured it out. What do you think Tari is about to do? Does she show him? Does she run? Does she negotiate? Drop your prediction in the comments right now, because what happens in the next 3 minutes of this story is going to determine everything." She set the phone on the desk. She opened the photographs. She pushed it toward him. He picked it up. She watched his face while he read. She had spent 22 months imagining this moment, and none of the versions she had rehearsed looked like this. Him reading in silence in a room that smelled of cedar and old paper, while the gathering his family had presided over for 30 years continued one floor above them. He scrolled through every photograph, every page. He did not speak. When he put the phone down, he placed it carefully back on the desk surface between them, as though it were something that deserved to be handled with consideration. "My father," he said. It was not a complete sentence. He was not looking at her. "The direction came from Daeho Min," she said. "You were 26. You were not at that meeting." He looked at her. Something passed through his face that was not quite pain and not quite relief, but occupied the space between them and deserved its own name. "You already knew I wasn't there," he said. "I found out tonight." "But you came here not knowing." She held his gaze. "I came here for the truth. I wasn't sure yet which version of it I'd find." She told him. All of it. Not performing grief or performing anger. Just speaking it the way her father had taught her to speak difficult things. Plainly, because the weight is already in the truth and dressing it adds nothing. Thomas Maro. 15 years. The contract. The gift he brought to that first meeting, a gesture of trust from a man who believed that trust was how you began things. The dissolution. The 14 months. The morning she sat on a concrete floor with his ledgers and understood for the first time that the man who had done this was not an abstraction but a name, and the name had an address, and the address was this house. Joonki listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend. He listened with the particular quality of a man who already knew something was wrong somewhere in the foundation of everything he had inherited, and was finally, in this room, being shown exactly where. When she was finished, the silence went on for a long time. Then he said, "The gift your father brought to that meeting, do you know what it was?" She didn't. He lifted his left wrist. He looked at the jade bracelet. He looked at it for a long moment with a stillness that was different from all his other kinds of stillness. "It came with the contract documents," he said. "A gift to my father from the partner, as a gesture of trust." He lowered his wrist slowly. "My father wore it until he died. I have worn it since." Tari went very still. She understood what he did not yet fully understand, because she had not yet told him her father's name, and he had not yet made the connection, and in the space between what he knew and what she was about to tell him, something tremendous was about to shift. She said, "My father's name was Thomas Maro. If this story has moved you in any way, right now is the moment to hit subscribe, because this channel exists for stories exactly like this one. Stories where the truth arrives wearing the thing you have been carrying every single day and simply never understood. Subscribe now so you never miss what comes next." He released Zuri before midnight. He sent Senyo Park to the East Gate himself, with instructions delivered in 2 sentences, and then he stood at the archive room window and looked out at the estate grounds while Tari stood behind him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "I am going to ask you something," he said, still facing the window, "and I need you to answer it exactly once, clearly, and then I will not ask again." She waited. "Did you come here only for this?" She turned the question in her mind. She had told herself yes for 22 months without examining the answer too closely. She examined it now. "I came here for the truth," she said. "I found more of it than I planned for." He turned from the window. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the hall at the beginning of the evening, except that all the layers of surface performance were gone now, from both of them, and what was left was just 2 people in a small room full of old documents. "Daeho Min," he said. "The documents. What do you intend to do?" "Nothing tonight," she said. "Nothing without thinking carefully about what I'm building and what I could break." She paused. "I am not my father. My father trusted without calculation. I calculate. But I am not going to destroy something carelessly just because I have the means." He said nothing, but something in the architecture of his face rearranged itself slightly, and she understood that this answer had mattered to him in a way that the previous ones had not. She picked up her phone from the desk. She looked at it once. She looked at him. "The truth about what Daeho Min did is already documented," she said. "What happens to it next? That's a conversation for people who are both clear-headed and not standing in a room at midnight. She held his gaze. "I'll be clear-headed in the morning." She walked to the archive room door. She paused with her hand on the frame. She turned the kente fabric from her wrist, slid the knot loose slowly. She held it for a moment. The frayed gold and green strip that her mother had tied there the morning she left, that she had worn every day through 2 years of patient, deliberate pursuit. She walked back to the desk. She laid it on the surface beside the documents. She did not leave a note. She walked out of the east wing into the pale dawn. Zuri was waiting on the road beyond the gate. She did not look back. Inside the archive room, Joonki Han stood at the desk for a long time. He picked up the strip of kente fabric. He turned it between his fingers. The gold and green threads, the worn edges, the knots that had held it on someone's wrist through something he was only beginning to understand the full length of. He did not know what it was. He did not know what she had meant by leaving it. He knew only that it mattered in a way that made him unwilling to put it down. He stood there as the estate lightened around him, holding in his hand a piece of something he had not earned yet and was already afraid of losing. If someone in your life needed to hear this story today, the one about a woman who carried something heavy for 2 years and carried it with grace, about a man who inherited damage he didn't cause and is only now learning its full cost, share this video with them. Because some stories are made to reach the people who need them. By morning, she had not taken his title or his house or his account ledgers. She had not dismantled anything with her hands. She had simply stood in a room full of buried truth and declined to leave it buried. She had placed on a desk the one thing that had kept her going through 2 years of loss and calculation, and she had walked out without explaining what it meant, because some things do not explain themselves to people who are not ready to understand them yet. By morning, Joonki Han owned the same empire he had owned the night before, the same property, the same authority, the same men who poured their cups in the correct order. But the room beneath his house had been visited by someone who knew exactly what was in it, and the man at his right hand had been measured by someone who would not be confused by warmth that had no depth to it. And on the archive desk beside his family's most carefully guarded secrets lay a strip of frayed fabric that he did not have the language to read yet. That is how an empire changes hands. Not loudly, not with force, with truth. Quietly placed, and two people in a room, and the long, patient work of a woman who loved her father enough to come all this way. Part 2 is coming, and when it does, you are going to find out what Joonki Han does with everything he now knows about Daeho Min, about his father's bracelet, and about a woman who walked out of his house at dawn and left the most important thing she owned on his desk without a word of explanation. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you are there the moment it drops, because the morning belongs to Tari Maro. But the story is just beginning. If this story pulled you in, you already know this is where you belong. More stories like this drop here every single day. Don't miss the next one.